Hi everyone, my name is Manuel Martinez, and this is another episode of Career Downloads, where each week and each episode I come and I hit the refresh button, bring on a different guest to learn a little bit more about their career, their journey, tips and tricks that they've learned along the way. And today I'm very excited. I have a good friend of mine, he is Alan Tyson, and with that, welcome Alan. How you doing?
Hey, good to see you, man. Thanks for having me. I know you talked about it and it's off the ground. You got an awesome space here, so thank you, man. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's took a little bit of work, but it's definitely, I think it's something that will be really beneficial to people in our industry and just looking to get into it, maybe who are curious, or if they're looking to either get into tech, which again, we've talked before, tech is very broad.
Yeah, definitely.
So having different perspectives from different people that do not only have different backgrounds, but also are in different roles. Even if you and me had gone through the same path, right? Hey, we went to the same places, worked, our experiences are gonna be very different, right? So I'm very excited, and even if people who are already in the industry, maybe they pick up some tips for their current role, or if they're looking to make a role change into something different.
Yeah, so. And I think that's one of the things that we kind of talked about too is, when we were first getting into tech and just kind of figuring some things out, there really wasn't a platform like this, right? I mean, there really wasn't, a way that you could kind of say, okay, well, let me see what somebody else who's successful or, who's had some level of success, like what have they done? But more importantly, like what are the things they wish they didn't do, right? So we kind of have that ability now, to kind of share some of those things. And I think just like you and I were talking a little bit, offline, there's so many more tools and resources that you have today to just scaffold and just be so much more successful, so much quicker. But a lot of times people don't, know about those things. So hopefully, like we can chat, we can share some of those things, and kind of put people in a better position than we were when we kind of first got started.
Oh, exactly. So let's start off and just kind of give me, again, it doesn't have to be very in depth, but just give me a little bit of background of kind of where you grew up and how you kind of slowly started and got interested in tech.
Yeah, so I was born originally in Ohio, and I kind of lived there for a few years, but I would say like, my hometown where I grew up is in Colorado. I grew up in Aurora, Colorado. Kind of went to school there, went to some college there, originally got my certs there. And for me, tech wasn't really where I was focused at. So, my sister, is one of my heroes, right? My sister Cynthia, and she kind of went to school and got her PhD, and I wanted to be a teacher. So that's the direction that I was going. I was going to school to be a teacher, and I was working for a cable company just to be able to get the school benefits to be able to go to school. And back then, I hate to admit it, but I didn't know a lot about printers, and I could put paper in, and, I just was not like a tech guy. So I worked, in customer service to be able to do that, to be able to go to school. There was a job that actually paid more money in a data center. Knew absolutely nothing about data center, didn't know anything about computers or any of that, but I knew that if I got the night shift job, I could go to school during the day. And I talked to the manager there and I said, look, I don't know a lot about technology. I'm applying for the job because I'm internal. If you give me an opportunity, I will definitely learn it. I want to be a teacher. Here's what some of my goals are. And he's like, okay. And getting into the data center exposed me to like computers and exposed me to technology. And then I was able to find out like what a router was and what a switch was. And that just kind of ignited, like this desire to learn more about tech. And then from there, I sort of like deviated away from wanting to be a teacher. I started getting more into tech, started learning more about it, started getting more certifications and figuring some of those things out. And then that led me to like navigate to network engineering and then being a senior network engineer and then, being in the director role for a while and wanting to get back into engineering and then working for like some major ISPs and, working here in Vegas. So it ended up kind of being a roundabout way to find something that I was really passionate about, but I had no idea because originally I wanted to be a teacher because that's something that I loved and sharing things was something I loved. And I think I kind of got that from my sister too. So yeah, it was a very different journey for me when it came to tech. I wasn't one of those people that just grew up and always wanted to know how stuff works. I was like way on the opposite.
So, but did you always have a natural curiosity, like just in general? I know not for tech, like, hey, how does this work? But just, were you a curious person? Did you enjoy challenges? Like what really kind of sparked your interest in technology once you got exposed?
Well, I always liked learning, right? I always liked learning new things. And, neuroscience and meta learning, which are some of the things that we've talked about before, were always like hobbies because I always found it like fascinating that how do you acquire a new skill? And once you acquire that new skill, how do you maintain it? And then how do you make sure you don't forget that new skill, which leads to things like how does spaced repetition work and how do we forget? So those type of things were always interesting to me, and I think I gravitated towards those more on the cognitive side because it was related to teaching. So I was always thinking about, like, if I had students, like, how would I reach them? How would I make sure I imparted that information to them? So a lot of experimentation. And because of that, when I got into technology, it was some of those same things. It's like, oh, okay, well, how does this work? I mean, when you click enter here, what happens? Or when routes need to go out to the internet, like, what do they do? How do they operate? And so that curiosity, I think, was just very important. And I think that's definitely something that you have to have no matter what it is, that you're learning. One, you need to be curious about it. Two, you have to be interested. Right? If you're not interested in it, it's very, very hard to acquire the knowledge. It's very, very hard to, maintain it. And I don't want to go off, like too far on a tangent, but, you have to have some kind of way to keep yourself engaged in whatever it is, that you're studying, that you're trying to learn, that you want to become good at. If you can't keep yourself engaged, in it and understand how you learn, then, ultimately you'll do yourself a disservice, and you may think, well, I'm not really good at this. And it may not have anything to do with you not being good at it. It's just you're approaching it in the wrong way.
Right. And definitely in this industry, right, as much as things change, right? Because I'm sure, similar to me, when you first got in, technology is way different than when we first started than where it is now, right? There's no such thing as cloud and, things of that nature. So when you said that you were going to be a teacher, right, and you were going to college, did you end up finishing, or was tech just so exciting to you that you ended up leaving school? What was kind of that path?
So, and I think that's where things really kind of diverged, because, when you think of like school, when you think of like learning something, kind of like in a classroom type of structure, school is designed to help you reach certain goals by a certain point, right? So there's a lowest common denominator there, which means that even if you want to go much further, I mean, there's things that you can do to do that, but you still have to kind of follow a syllabus and a course, right? Things are different now with different universities where you can take like as many credits as you want and do some of those things, but back then it really wasn't that way. And so it got to the point where it's like, well, in the tech industry, things became much more skill focused, which is, I am much less concerned, even now when I sit on interviews or I do those type of things, I'm much less concerned about maybe how long you went to school. I'm much less concerned about, what certifications you have, even though those things help. I'm more concerned about, do you have the skills to be able to do this? A lot of interviews, like when I worked at Switch over at the data center, a couple other places, we would give people GNS3 simulators, which is, here's GNS3, configure BGP in this way, configure iBGP between these two links, configure eBGP on the edges, and let's get routes flowing back and forth, and here's your IP addresses to do that. So if you have certifications, great. If you don't have certifications, great. What really matters is being able to perform well in that lab, right? And so that requires personal study. That requires putting together your own equipment. And that's where things kind of diverged, because it's like, well, you move to an industry that is more skill-based, where you have to produce results. And to do that, that takes a lot of time. That takes more study. And that's why I kind of diverged, and I said, well, I'm going to focus on some of the certifications, and certifications in and of themselves, I just want to make that point like super clear, that to me, they don't really matter that much, right? What a certification does is it helps you study, and it helps you learn the skill that you need to do X. So if you approach certifications in that way, not just how do I quickly get the answers and figure out how to pass, but if you approach it and say, well, I need to understand all these things to be able to do a job, that's where certifications really help. And so when you do that, that takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort, it takes understanding how you learn, it takes like this whole kind of matrix of things that, we may have an opportunity to talk about today, if not, maybe later, but it becomes a different environment, because the things that you learn on a degree path are things that are required for you to get that degree that may have absolutely nothing to do with your career later, and may be things that you never look at again. But when you're going down a certification path, those things are relevant, because at some point you'll have to leverage some of those things in your career, right? So you kind of have to decide which direction you want to go. And I kind of veered this way because it's a more, production-based type of job. No one's going to ask me to tell them what I learned about Marcus Aurelius in an interview, right, when I was going to school. Maybe, I don't know if there's still, who knows, right? But this is very rare, but someone will say, okay, so can you sign in to this, particular router? Can you bring up a BGP neighborship? Can you put some route filters on it? And can you enable route dampening? Because we need to do that, right? That's a skill that you learn that you're gonna have to produce. So that's why I say it becomes very different, very, very different.
Yep, and I agree with you because I've seen a lot of people that go through and get a certification and they're like, hey, I have this cert, I should be able to get this job. Well, do you know it, right? You start asking, especially in an interview, and I think that's where people who are maybe newer to the industry or newer to certifications, they get those and they expect, I had a similar situation and I discussed with somebody else where coming out of college, right? I actually went and got an MIS degree, right? Management Information Systems. And I was like, cool, I got a degree. Everybody's just gonna be flocking towards me. And again, it's very skill-based. They're like, cool, you have this degree. Where's your experience? What do you know how to do? And I'm like, well, I've built my own computers. I've done basic stuff. And they're like, well, thanks, try again. But again, I started studying for the certifications, like the A+, and really understanding and saying, oh, okay, these are the types of things that I need to know. This is how this works, together, and pulling apart my own PC. Okay, hey, okay, this is how this communicates. What happens if I do this? So that curiosity. Now, as you're kind of going and studying for these certifications, what's kind of your process to not only learn what you need for the exam, but also pick up those skills? You mentioned GNS3, which is a simulator.
Right.
Is that, I know that sounds like they gave you the opportunity to learn in that data center. Is that how you picked up, at least initially, was it just all hands-on? Did you kind of build your own lab at home? Kind of how did you really get?
Yeah, and I'll try not to geek out too much about this, right? Because I know some stuff that we talked about, because I'm really passionate about not only learning and neuroscience, but PKM tools, right? And this is something that I know we've
and
kind of shared.
PKM tools are?
Yeah, so PKM tools are personal knowledge management tools.
Okay.
And there's a bunch of them out there. There's Roam Research, there's LogSec, there's Obsidian, there's Tana, there's Remnote. I use Roam Research. I know that you use LogSec. Different tools that do basically the same thing. Not like an endorsement for any one of them. We don't get a kickback, from anybody for mentioning those. But people were for a long time, and a lot of people still are, using legacy tools like an Evernote, like a OneNote, like a Google Notes. These tools that just aren't really designed for linking different type of things together, right? So for me, when I originally started, I was kind of using some of those like legacy tools to try to say, okay, well, how do I learn some of this information? Today, however, if I'm picking up like new skills, I'm using, Roam Research, and I'm taking my notes for some of these different things there. Because, one, I would say the most important thing is you have to have a repository of some kind to put your successes in, to put your failures in. Why did I fail on this? What was it about this particular thing that I thought I knew that I didn't know? Just like, and not to use the term like life coach, but you really sort of have to be your own kind of life coach. You think of a coach who manages a team, he's looking at players, right? To say, okay, you made this mistake over here. If you had moved this way and done this, it would have been different. If I'm studying through something and I don't get it, I'm writing that down because I journal every day. So I'll journal, here's what happened today, here's what I did. I ran into this problem. I thought I had the answer. Why didn't I have the answer? Was it overconfidence? Was it something that I just didn't understand? Okay, I didn't understand this piece. What skills do I need to understand that? So then I'll make some notes and I'll go and I'll learn those type of things. I'll put them in, like my Roam Research kind of database. Then I'll go back and I'll say, okay, do I understand this concept? Because it's not enough just to know how to do something. You have to know how it works. You can get commands from anywhere to plug in to bring up a router. I mean, you can use Terraform and Ansible to automate and build things, but what do you do when it breaks, right? So you always have to ask yourself when you're learning something, okay, I know how to do this, but do I know how it works? And then once you learn that skill, that one small, tactical unit, then you need to go do it. So I've learned how to do this, I understand it, now I can spin up a free AWS lab for free, right? They'll give you credits to do that. You can do the same thing with Azure. GNS3 is for network simulation. There's EVNG, which is another, type of network simulator that you can use. So you have to build like an environment where you can go through these things and run through your own simulations so that way when you go to the real world, you're not scared and you're not worried. Like even to this day, if I have to do a network change or I have to build something, I model the whole thing in EVE-NG first. Make sure I understand it, test it. Like I have a mini version in the simulated software of what I do at work, so that I can say, okay, what happens if this link goes down? What happens if this breaks, right? And then when I learn those new things, I put those, into Roam Research as a lesson learned. So that way, the next time I get ready to go and do a project, I can say, okay, what are all the lessons learned that I have about Juniper switches that are MX devices for the last change controls that I did, to make sure that I'm not forgetting that information. Because if you go through a situation where you fail, you figure out how to do it, and you recover from that, but you haven't documented that anywhere, then you're doing yourself a disservice. So you have to have some sort of mechanism to be able to document what you're doing, document what you're good at, document where you're failing, improve where you're failing, and then make sure you're getting better over time. Because we think, and then I'll, kind of jump off my soapbox, kind of sit down. But, we think sometimes that we are doing better than we are. We think that we are learning continuously sometimes better than we are. But when you're journaling every day and you're documenting, here's what I'm doing, you have a log that says, you know what? I was supposed to study 3 days last week. I did not. And why did I not study 3 days last week? Okay, well, some people came over and we had dinner and we did some things. Okay, how do I make sure that that doesn't happen? How do I make sure that I say, wait a minute, I still need to make sure that I'm studying every day to continue to get better, right? So when you journal and you log and you keep track of what you're doing, it gives you that ability to keep getting better over time. Because, one of my I would say one of my heroes that I've never met, right, is this guy named Vladimir Horowitz. And he's, if you forget anything I say, check out this dude. Vladimir Horowitz is awesome. He was probably one of the greatest pianists who ever lived, I would say, just based on, what I've seen and some of the stuff that I've read. But he had this quote, and his quote was like, if I don't practice for a day, I know it. If I don't practice for 2 days, my wife knows it. If I don't practice for 3 days, my audience knows it. So you have to be, when it comes to tech, you have to be studying every day. You have to be reviewing every day with spaced repetition. We can talk about that later. And then you have to be labbing. And you have to do those type of things maybe for 30 minutes, 40 minutes every single day. Because if you miss 1 day, then you miss 2 days, you miss 3 days, then you have dread when you get ready to go back to work on Monday. Oh man, I don't want to go back, because you haven't touched it. But if you're touching it a little every day and tech becomes a part of who you are, then it's so much easier to move forward and learn new things. But you have to do it every day.
Right.
And I'll stop. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on and on.
No, and that's good, because you're bringing up some really good information and good topics. Now, do you feel that kind of journaling and writing a lot of this stuff down also helps with memory retention? Because I know that I'm not as consistent. I've gotten much better now, but I was never consistent, and I noticed, it took me a while, that when I would document, hey, this is what I'm doing, I was able to remember it a lot better. I had it documented so I could then pass it on to somebody else. Oh, hey, I need to do this. I can go through and teach you, or hey, here's this document, so that I can move on. And that was one of the ways that I was always able to kind of move on to my next role, is because I documented everything I did, how I set it up, why I set it up, and all that's there. But it also built an overconfidence in me that, oh, I know this, because again, I would write it down. So when I wouldn't write it down, I would always struggle to remember, how did I do this? And I would try and, again, find that journal or find some method to look for it. Now I'm Googling, I'm starting that cycle all over again. I know I did this once, I don't remember, Let me go through. Do you feel that that's part of the process of learning? Is it just, again, writing it down, and is that helping you for memory retention?
Yeah, so, and we can talk a little bit about, memory and kind of how things work, but to an extent, yes. So when I'm journaling, it's 7 a.m. in the morning, or it's 8 a.m. and I'm making a new entry. Okay, I'm working on this project for a while, right? And I'll kind of make some notes on it. And then when I finish with that, maybe it's 9 o'clock and I'm okay, I'm gonna start on this. Kind of helps me look at my day and say, how efficient was I, right? I mean, if there's blocks of time where I wasn't really as productive as I would like to be, I do a recap at the end of the day, and it's how did this day go? What are the things that went well? What are the things that didn't go well? What are the things we want to try to improve tomorrow? So it definitely helps you, when it comes to memory. But the other thing that I think is super helpful when it comes to memory is there was this, German psychologist, he's Dr. Hermann Ebbinghaus, And he did this experiment in a silo, which you typically never do, right? If I do an experiment in a silo, people kind of question it. But he released his findings, and then over decades, other scientists and other researchers have been able to come back and confirm the results, which is he wanted to find out how we remember, but how we forget. And what he found out was that, typically if you study something, let's say, in the first day, first several hours, you're going to retain a lot more of that information, right? After several hours goes by, there's a declination where you start to forget. After several days goes by, there's another stark declination. And then it gets to the point where you can only remember a small percentage of the things that you originally studied. But what he was able to track is that if you do something on the first day, and then instead of not reviewing it for several hours, then you review it, there's a curve where then you kind of start to slowly forget a little bit less, but then you review it before you start to forget, and then you start to forget a little bit less, and then you review it. What ends up happening is you continue to review those things until they transition into your long-term memory. So now these things that are important to you that you want to remember, you don't forget. And there's free software like Anki that does it. The original software was like SuperMemo, where you input in these things in kind of like a flashcard style. Hey, X plus Y is whatever, or whatever you're trying to remember. And the software prompts you based on the research that was done by Dr. Ebbinghaus on when you should review it. So you look at the app and it says, okay, it's time for you to review this piece of information. So what you can do are those core pieces of information, those things that you are like, I need to remember this. You break down into small units. You load them into Anki or SuperMemo. Again, I think on iOS there might be a cost, but on Android it's free. I mean, the PC app is free, the Mac app is free, but there's other pieces of software that use the same space repetition algorithm. You put the information in there and you let the software tell you when to review. So if this is important to you, it's something that you need to remember, you use modern science to do it. Like when people say, well, Al, you learned Japanese on your own, like how did you do some of those things? Well, not because I'm super smart, but because I looked at what other people did. Other people took the most commonly spoken words, they put those words in Anki along with grammar and sentence patterns, and they just continue to review those things. And then once it transitions to your long-term memory, then you don't forget that piece of information, right? So just like you said, if you're constantly interacting with it every day, you're constantly looking at it, then it helps you to remember it, but it doesn't help it transition into your long-term memory, which is the reason why if I asked you what the last password was that you had to use at your job, you may or may not remember. You remember it because you're doing it every day. But after 45 days, after 90 days, that information never made it to your long-term memory. It was really only in short-term because you were doing it every day, right? So you just have to come up with a strategy for the information that's important, that you're like, hey, this is important, I need to know this. Let's use some spaced repetition to do that. Some of the other things that are big, that are broad, that you just need to remember, okay, I fixed this, I was pretty sure I did it this way, it was related to this device, then you can kind of use your back-end system, whether it's LogSec or Roam or whatever, to be able to find it. So it's just like a balance kind of between the two. What do I need to know for my job every day that I can't forget? And then what are the things that I need to have a pretty good understanding of how I resolved it or how the big concept works that I can go find?
Okay, nice. So then you're picking up these skills, and this is obviously the way that you're going through and you're learning all this. Now, in that data center role, and I know you quickly at the beginning kind of showed us your kind of path and things that you
all
did.
Over the place.
No, and that's good, right? So you gave us a quick highlight. So now, in that data center role, how long were you there, and before you kind of transitioned off into that next one? And what was the process that you came through to say it's time to move on to the next role?
So when I first kind of went to the data center, there were just a lot of different things that I had no idea what they were. We were mounting like reel-to-reel tapes, and they had like AS400s, and they had like mainframes, and they had all these computers, and I'm like, oh man, I'm never really gonna learn like all of this stuff, right? And so when I was first coming in, what I ended up doing, and it's not something that you may be able to do every single place, right? But I'll kind of share it anyway. We were in an operations environment. And in an operation environment, things break. And then you have to fix things. People submit tickets. And then you have to work through a ticket. You have to figure things out. So the first thing that I did is I said, okay, can I have access to your ticketing system, which was Remedy? And they're like, oh yeah, sure. And what I would do is I would just go through and I would look at how many trouble tickets were closed last month. They closed like 400 trouble tickets last month, right? And hopefully they never see this video. But what I did is at night, right, I would print up 100 trouble tickets. And I would read through the trouble tickets to see how they were fixed. because I didn't really understand all the different pieces of equipment, but I knew that we were in this environment where things break, we had to fix it. So then I was able to say, okay, well, this is how you fix this type of issue. Here's the technology involved. And I would just go research those different pieces of technology that were involved. And so then I started to get much more comfortable, because if last month we had 100 trouble tickets that came in, and out of that 100 trouble tickets, let's say 70 of them were about this issue, and I would focus on really learning those 70 things. Like, what are all the different pieces of technology? What do they do? How do they operate? And I would write it down. This piece of technology is here. They fix this. What does this do? Where is this? Who is the person that fixed this? And if I saw somebody who was really good at what they do, the one advice I would give anybody is, just like we're talking, right? Sometimes people like talking about, themselves and what they're comfortable with. I would go to that person and be like, hey, you fix these issues very, very efficiently. I've been studying through your notes. What type of feedback can you give me? I mean, how do you do that? Like, what's your thought process? How do you approach that? And they would say, well, I learned that because I read this manual, or I learned that because I took this course. And so I would try to reverse engineer how people were fixing things. And then the second thing I would do is I would talk to my boss and I would say, who are the top performers? Like, who are the people, not just in this data center, but in the other data centers nationally, who you think are just awesome, who you wish you could clone? And he gave me a list. And guess what I did? I found those people's IDs in Remedy, and I looked them up. And I started studying how these people who were really good, who were better than me, because I didn't understand anything, how are they fixing issues? Because you had to document what you did. What were they doing? I would ask some people, I'd email them. Some people didn't, I don't really have time for that. Other people would be like, sure, I want to help you. So when you're approaching something, kind of that you don't know, at least in an operational environment, that's how I did it. Finding out who the people that were really good at it, looking at what their thought process was, because the idea for me was this concept of scaffolding, right? If you're really good at something, let's say, right, and you know how to fix these things, and this is the same process that I kind of approach today. This is why I think journaling is so important. What I'm trying to do is I'm trying to close the gap between how you think and how I think. So I'm looking at, okay, what would I have done in this situation? I would have done this, this, and this. What did you do in this situation? You did this, 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 and this, and this. Or maybe you didn't do any of the steps that I took. You did these two things and you fixed it. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do I close that gap, right? How do I get to the mental state where I'm able to do the things that you do? And the way you do that is you look at the process that they took. And then when my knowledge stops here, I'm like, okay, how did they fix these things? Oh, they were aware of this piece, and they were aware of this piece and this piece. And then I'll reach out to that person and I'll ask them. Even now, I'll journal and I'll be like, okay, I fixed this thing. I went through this. I did all of these steps. And then I'll show JTAC when I talk to them. Or I can show Cisco TAC, or I can show another engineer, and they say, yeah, dude, you were right. This is right, this is right, this is right. Oh, you drew this wrong conclusion. Probably because you didn't understand how the route maps worked. If you understood this part and you fixed this, everything else would be easier. So when you journal like that and you keep track of what you're doing and you're humble about it and say, I want to get better, you can show your results to other people. Just like you think of a scientist. Scientist says, I discovered, planet Manny. The first thing people are going to do is say, show us your work. And scientists, here's my work. Other people look at it, critique it. Yep, that's right. Oh, you made a mistake here, and then you get better. So that's how you continue to iterate. That I still do that to this day. I try to surround myself with people I think who know more than me, share what I'm doing, get feedback, and move forward. And I started that doing it in the data center.
And is that something you were always comfortable asking questions? And did you ever get any pushback, from people that you felt weren't as willing to help? Because I know that that's something that I've been pretty fortunate in my career. Like, I've usually had somebody, at least in the beginning, I was paired with somebody that kind of was, again, willing to help and train. So some of it I did learn on my own at some point, but I had somebody there to kind of guide me through originally. And they were able to make me feel very comfortable admitting or understanding that I don't know something, right? Because he was like, hey, do you know how to do X, Y, Z? I know how to do X. I've never, Y and Z. Z, I've never even heard of. Y, I kind of know. Okay, that's fine. And they made me comfortable to say, it's okay to not know everything, and it's okay to ask questions. Is that something that you had always had the ability to do, or did you kind of grow that skill? How did that come about?
Yeah, so and that's a great question because, originally it's kind of hard because you're worried about your job and you're like, well, if I'm not qualified, they're going to get rid of me if I'm asking all these questions, but originally it kind of took me some time to just say, okay, well, how am I going to get better, right? There's this idea called the zone of proximal development, right? The zone of proximal development is kind of where you want to operate, but within that, it makes this point that there are certain points that you can't get beyond without some help. You kind of want to operate in an area that's a little bit challenging for you, a little bit difficult, so you have to struggle and you're kind of learning and you're getting better. But then you reach a point where without some sort of help, whether that's YouTube, whether it's somebody to talk to, whether it's a book, a manual or something, you just can't get past as an individual, right? You have to figure out how to do it. And so, if I were, like telling anybody today, I would say adjust to that quicker than I did, because it took me a little bit to really say, okay, well, wait a minute, and kind of deconstruct it and be humble enough to ask some of those questions. Because there's this, sometimes you work with people like we talked about, some people who are engineers or who are, cloud people or who are whatever, they act like they've been doing it their whole life. They forget there was a day when they didn't know it and they looked at it for the first time, they didn't understand it either. And so sometimes you don't get help from certain people. Sometimes I would reach out to people and, I would ask them and they wouldn't want to respond, right? And I would say, but for every couple of people who didn't want to respond, there was always somebody who did, right? So you just have to, if you want to get better, you just have to keep asking, you have to keep trying, you have to keep doing, research on it, seeing what you can figure out. The other thing that I would say too is that even like in our field, and there's been research either way, right? The Dunning-Kruger effect is something that everybody's heard of. It's been around for a while. Some other researchers, I don't really know if it works, but it's been accepted for a long time, which is sometimes people who work in a field for a long period of time aren't really aware of the things that they don't know. And you assume sometimes that you are better than you really are. I've been doing this for 20 years. Well, just because you've been an engineer for 20 years doesn't mean that you're a great engineer. Because if you stopped learning 5 years after you got the job, you've just been coasting on your Juniper, your Cisco knowledge or whatever for the past 15 years, right? So people sometimes draw this conclusion that we're better than what we are based on the amount of time that we're doing it, right? And so you really have to get past that. I'll share like a personal story. Just like I want to say like a month ago, I reached out to Mauricio Recker, great guy. I actually met him at AWS reInvent a couple of years ago. He is one of the lead engineers for Riot Direct. And Riot Direct, from like a networking standpoint, on the planet, they've built like this kind of amazing architecture that, even AWS leverages in certain areas because of, their resiliency. And so, I met him, he's like, hey, let's stay in touch. And I pinged him on, LinkedIn and we chatted and I said, hey, just wanted to reach out. What do you think are qualities that a great network engineer should have? I've been doing network engineering for a while. I like to think, I'm pretty good at it, but his network and what he's doing is on a totally different level. And so we chatted a little bit and he gauged my experience, answering his questions. He's like, okay, he's like, well, for you, I would look at this. Let's look at some stuff on segment routing. Let's look at some stuff over here. These are some things that I think will just continue to help you grow and continue to help you round out your knowledge, right? So if you're not humble to be able to want to improve, if you think you know everything, then when it comes to getting feedback, you don't want it, and you're certainly not going to go get it. But I try to make it a habit to reach out to people who I've met on LinkedIn, people who are really good at what they do. What type of advice can you give me? Like, what do you do to be successful? So I think that's a trait that you just need to continue to have throughout your entire career, but you need to be humble and you need to understand that just because you've been doing it for 10 years, for 15 years, doesn't mean that you can't learn somebody else who's been doing it for a shorter amount of time, who might be doing it at a much bigger scale.
Right. Oh, that's amazing. And so you mentioned you wish you would have learned that earlier in your career. So like, are we talking a couple years? Is that something that 10 years ago? What's that timeline of when you wish you would have learned?
I would probably say when I was first getting in, so I got the data center job, I was kind of going through that. Then I got like some of my first network engineering jobs. And I think I was more worried about keeping the job and more worried about showing what I needed, showing the knowledge that I had, like this is why I'm here and this is why I should be here, instead of saying, okay, well, how can I absorb the knowledge of all these people around me, right? How can I ask more questions? How can I do some of those things? I think I would have scaffolded much better. I think I would have figured out things much quicker if I had done that. Okay. So I think over the years, it's kind of gotten easier. And sometimes people will look, you know, I mean, they're like, wow, I mean, you just asked like, you know, like 10 questions in this meeting about some stuff. And I'm like, yeah. Did you know the answers to any of those questions? No, but I didn't want to appear like I didn't know. And I'm like, that doesn't matter, right? Do you think I really care? If I'm sitting in a meeting and you think I care, if other people think that I asked a bunch of questions, if I end up getting the knowledge that I need to know to be able to grow and move forward, great, right? I'll be the last person at an AWS session asking questions, and I'll be the first person there, right? Because I want to continue to learn. It's like you remember that movie Dragonheart? Like way back in the day, Dragonheart?
It sounds familiar. I'm trying to remember what.
Yeah, it's the one like with Sean Connery. He kind of voiced the dragon, and it had like Randy Quaid in it, I think. And so, not to like kind of deviate, but in like Dragonheart, there's this whole scene where you've got the one guy who I think he was related to the king, and you know Quaid was training him to be a great swordsman, and he was training him how to have honor. Well, at the end, what ends up happening is he ends up becoming like an evil king, and he's like, "Wait, I didn't teach you these things, right?" That's what Quaid's character says. He's like, "I would have told you anything to get the knowledge that you had." See, he was concerned about getting better, and I'm not saying become like evil and ruthless, but what I am saying is that sometimes some people will be condescending, and they will give you information, and you have to put them being condescending out of your mind and get the information from them to learn. Some people you might not want to talk to. They might be irritated. They might be hard to deal with. And you go and you ask them a question, and they may answer it, and they might be a little condescending to you. But you have to focus. At the end of the day, I'm getting the knowledge that I need to get better. So if you can focus on that this is about continuing to get better each and every day and growing your skills, you'll surpass people like that. But if you're worried about how you look, if you're worried about asking questions, if you're worried about, people should probably, you can't get better without admitting the things that you don't know. And the only way you find out the things that you don't know are by study and research and then getting the answer to those things to be able to move forward. And those are the things I wish I would have learned a lot earlier. I don't think that I was necessarily arrogant, but I think I was like overly shy, and I was afraid to ask those type of questions. I was afraid to have people peer review some of my work. Yeah, my configuration worked and it got the job done, but was it optimal? Could it have been done better, right? Could I have saved time in doing it, right? So those are the things that you're after, and I think I'd probably know a lot more about everything, right, if I had done that earlier on in my career.
Okay, interesting. So then as you're kind of going, developing the skills, you're becoming a really good, eventually it sounds like you got out of the data center and moved into more of a networking engineer role. And what made you kind of go, you mentioned at one point going to be a director. So kind of, again, it sounds like same thing with when you went to teaching, right? Like you're at a crossroads. So what made you go director level as opposed to kind of staying in the engineer?
Yeah, so this is like a funny story. Wow, I did not know you were going to ask that, but this is good. So here's what ends up happening. I'm a network engineer for the hospital system, right? So I worked for HCA hospital system for years, and I was a network engineer, kind of did some stuff, senior tech, had done a lot of different things. And one of the things that was always important was I wanted to understand the interview process. Like, to get to this level, what are the type of skills that they look for? And for a long time, even as a network engineer, I would still interview. Like, I would look at, different places, and I would say, okay, I'm going to interview at, the Cosmo or something to be a senior network engineer. Don't know if I even have the qualifications to do it. But if I get an interview, what are they looking for, right? What are the type of things type of questions that they're asking, right? To be able to grow your skills. And I could do that now more easily with things like, LinkedIn. I can look at a senior network engineer job for Netflix, and I can kind of look at the qualifications, but a lot of those things weren't published like once upon a time, right? So I wanted to understand what it was like to be a director. Like, what are the type of things that they were looking for? So they would have a book club where they'd go through like 5 dysfunctions of a team, and what got you here won't get you there. And I would join those just to kind of understand what the mentality was like. And so when the interview process came along, my director at the time, he said, you should interview for it. He's like, just to understand what the process is. So I go through and I understand what the process is. I'd done some research on some of these different things and felt like I understood it, but I wanted to see. So I go through the interview process, and they're asking me questions about teams and dynamics and how you would handle things and what you would do and how you transition from like a technical role into a director role, because it's different, right? You have to drop your technical skill, you now have to focus on teams and inner dynamics. And So I did all those things and ended up making it to like the final round of interviews, never ever thinking that I would be offered the job because I was up against some other people who had been directors for a while. And then I get a call on a Thursday that says, "Hey, Alan, you're going to be our new director." And I was like, "What? Excuse me?" I didn't really think I was necessarily qualified for this. I was interviewing. I wanted to go through the process and kind of understand. And the senior director talks to me. He's like, "No." He's like, "You understand what we're trying to do." He's like, "You understand the importance of bridging the gap between tech and between being a director, and you'll understand how to interface with the CMO at the hospital, and you help us do all these things." And I wasn't thinking of myself as being a director. I was thinking of myself as someone who I want to go through this process. I want to show I want to move forward. I want to understand. I want to learn more. But I ended up getting the job. And so I accepted it. And I did the job for a while. I mean, I enjoyed it. I learned, a lot about a lot of different things in healthcare and how they all work. But one of the other things that I learned too is that it's to say that you work in healthcare. When you work at a division office as a network engineer, I don't want to say that's disingenuous, but it's not the same. When you are a director in a hospital and you're going on rounds every day and you're seeing cancer patients every day and you're hearing conversations about, well, these rooms will probably clear out because we think they're going to pass away, and you're seeing all the reasons why you don't want to go to the hospital, that's when you really realize that you're working in healthcare. And so once I got to that level and I was in the hospital every day and I was doing these things, I developed like a much greater appreciation for clinicians, and doctors and nurses and these people who have to somehow figure out how to compartmentalize all these challenging things that they see every day and then go home to their families and not cry. And there were days I would leave work and I would cry in my car behind some of the stuff that I saw, because every day I would go on these rounds. And so I decided, you know what, while I like kind of this like director aspect and some of these things, I've learned, quite a bit. My heart is still in network engineering. That's still something that I want to do. I want to get back into network engineering. Maybe at some point, I might kind of look at the director side of things, but it really helped me understand what it was like at this level and the interactions that take place at that level. But then it also helped me to say, okay, well, I would much rather be back, kind of in technology, working on some of those things, learning a bunch of new things, because and this is just between, me, you, and everybody who watched the podcast, but, I think if the longevity that you have as a director, sometimes in any technical field, right? If there's a layoff, can you get 4 more director jobs on your way home? But if you're an engineer, a cloud architect, how many jobs can you get if the economy changes, right? So there were a lot of different factors. Once, I kind of got over the sadness of, going through some of those things every day. It's like, okay, well, let's look at this. What do you want to do? Well, here's why. I kind of make pros and cons list. Want to get back into tech? Why? Well, because of learning and doing some of these things. And what happens if the economy shifts? So you kind of refactor all those things into it. So that's kind of how I ended up there. I was never really planning on it, but when I had the opportunity, I took it. And then when things changed, I'm like, okay, you know what? Let's make a change. It's, I was a little bit concerned, but I'm like, hey, you pivoted once years ago. You were going to be a teacher. You pivoted to tech, right? You pivoted to director. You have to be willing to pivot. We're going to pivot. We're going to go back in engineering.
Right. Oh, that's cool. And as kind of that process of being at the director, right? So you kind of got I'm going to call it a peek behind the curtain.
Yeah.
When you went back into engineering, do you think that helped or hindered you moving forward, knowing what it's like, that level above? Because I did at one point, similar to you, I went and I had that crossroads where I decided to become a manager. I did that for a while, and again, my heart was in tech. While I was managing a small team, it was also still a lot of very hands-on. But then at some point, they're starting to grow. I've been in the role for a little bit, and they're like, hey, we need you to be less hands-on, more management. And at some point, now that I was a manager, they're like, hey, kind of the next level up is go director level. Yeah. And I decided, you know what, that's not for me, but it gave me an appreciation. And I think for me moving forward, I had a different understanding of what a manager is, and what a good manager is. Do you think that helped or hindered you? Because I know some people that have done that and they're like, oh, now I've seen the politics. I hate, it hinders them in the fact that they kind of like, I know what that's like. And other people where I feel it helped me. I know what my manager goes through. I know what my director now goes through because I got that peek behind the curtain, and I think it helps me become a better employee for them.
You know, I think it's a little bit of both, because on the one hand, you understand the struggle a lot more. You understand you're dealing with things like, budgets. You're dealing with things like raises. I've got a certain percentage and I have to figure out how to give that percentage across the board, right? How am I fair? How am I equitable about that? You understand the challenges of writing people up, and you have people's, who have families and livelihoods, but you have people above you who are expecting things from you. So I think on the one hand, it does help you kind of understand what also, goes on, like you said, behind the curtain. But I think the flip side of that is that you also understand what goes on behind the curtain. And so when people come to you and they try to tell you, well, we can't do this because of this, that's not the case. When people try to say, well, I really wish we could, pivot this way and do this, you can say, man, you don't tell them, it's not the case, but you can give them the look, and mentally you're saying, you and I both know that's not how that operates, right? When you tell me that you can't do this, but you'd really like to, you and I both know that's not really how that is. You and I both know that you came to this meeting today with a predetermined agenda on what we were going to do, and this is just an exercise to make us feel like we're part of the process when we're really not, right? Because you're using the same verbiage that, I was trained to use when we all read 5 dysfunctions of a team, and you're quoting it directly, right? So I think it helps, because you can really see the people who are trying to be good directors, trying to be good managers, who are, trying to move forward. But then I think on the other hand, you can, see people who are telling you things, not necessarily understanding that you were in that role. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I was meeting with somebody, and I won't say who and I won't say where, right? And we're talking about something, and they make a comment, and then I say something back, and they say, well, how do you know that? I said, well, I used to be, a director for years. Oh, okay. Well, the reason why I really said that was because of, first it was, well, where at? Well, at the hospital, worked over here. Oh, okay. Well, I said that because of this. I mean, I'm sure you understand. It's like, okay, well, I do, but your original statement to me was based under the auspices that I didn't know, because I had never operated at that level, right? So I think it's kind of a 50-50 situation. But, I think, at the end of the day, that's one of the things that I really like about network engineering and cloud architecture and some of those areas is I have this sphere where I am 100% accountable for what I do. And I have this area where I could build, operate, be innovative in this box, right? And my success in this area is not really dependent on anybody else. When you're a director, you have people on your team maybe who aren't performing, you have to get those people performing. And if you're having a hard time getting them performing or performance managing them out of the business, they can get somebody else to get rid of you, right? I mean, so there's just a whole other level of dynamic where you have multiple vectors of control that kind of comes at you the higher you go.
Right.
But if you're in the operations-isk type area, I think it makes it easier to operate. And I think you see that, and I think we probably saw that more once you go to that side of the fence for a while, and then you look, and then you come back. Right. And I would always encourage anybody, your career is your career. Never wish that you would have done X. Man, I wished I would have gone over, I might have really liked it, try it. The worst thing that happens is it doesn't work out, you don't like it, and you can move back. If you are still alive and you have a good heartbeat, you can change it, right? You're never locked into anything that you want to do. Try different things out. Find something that you're passionate about, that you love. I mean, I love what I do. Every day I get to come over, I get to play with cool stuff. I have an awesome environment. You have to deal with the drama of people, but that's everywhere. But you really need to have something that you like doing, that you will research, when you're not at work, where you experience time dilation, where you're like, wow, I was researching this thing and wow, it's been 3 hours, right? That's what you need to feel for whatever career you decide. And if you're not feeling that, then pivot and find something until you do.
No, that's great advice. I mean, and I think someone that's getting into tech, or even somebody that's already in there, right? There's so many areas, like you're in networking, it turns out you really dislike networking. Guess what? There's so many other different roles, type careers. There could be something else that, that maybe you have more of an interest in. Because I know I did that. I mean, at one point I thought I wanted to be a network guy. Like I just saw all the network guys kind of walking around, going in the closets, and like, oh, I want to learn networking. I quickly learned that that's not for me.
Yeah.
Like I did not enjoy it. enjoyed learning about it. Can I configure a router for you? No. But I think that process helped me understand, gave me a good baseline so that when I talk to a network engineer, or when we're designing something, to collaborate and say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do with my servers, this is what I'm setting up, can you kind of help me, and ask those questions like, hey, how would we set up the VLAN structure for this, things of that nature. It helped me understand. It helped me get an appreciation for that, but it also made me understand that I don't like networking.
Yeah, exactly. Right?
I have no interest. It's interesting to me, but I wouldn't want to do that full time. So,
cool. No, you're right, man. I mean, and you really have to, it's such a great point. You have to find, kind of the things, that you're interested in, right? I mean, so like we grew up like in the skater era and, Tony Hawk, like one of the greatest skaters alive, but like one of my favorite skaters was this guy named Chaz Ortiz. He was awesome, right? And Chaz Ortiz had this great quote. He's like, if you don't want it, why are you even trying? Right? If you don't like what you're doing, you'll never be good at it.
right.
And you want to be good at it, not only for yourself, but to have self-fulfillment, but to move forward. So if you're not, if you're not digging it, if you're not interested in that thing, move on to something else. I always tell people your stress should be the people you work with, right? The drama that you have to deal with should be in the people, because people are a dynamic that will never be solved. But if you don't like what you're doing, when the drama of the people goes away and you've got that work, whatever that work is, and you look at it and you're like, I don't want to do this, then there's a problem.
Right.
Because there's so many other things in tech that you could be doing that you will actually like.
Yeah, and I think I'm glad you said that, because I know a lot of people try to go into tech and they see, well, hey, I can make a lot of money, in tech. Hey, that's where the money's at. Hey, I can have a successful career. That is the case, but I think you touched on it, is the people that usually do are the people that are constantly learning, that are doing that. It's just not, hey, I passed this certification, I got in, I should be making 6-7 figures. Like, no, that's not how this works.
No.
Right? It's very much, you have to put in the time, you have to start. Because, I mean, you mentioned it where you got started. I mean, I'm sure when you came in, they weren't like, Alan, we'll take a chance on you, and here's a 6-figure salary for you to figure out how to install a printer.
No, not, I was like the lowest paid guy. And he kind of let me know, he's like, I'm going to bring you on. He's like, but it's all based on percentages. And I ended up getting raises and moving up. But yeah, I mean, you have to, it's like training camp, right? Or being a starter for, any team anywhere. You have to continue to earn that job. When you're in the end, so government's a little different, right? And that could be a whole show. But, on the enterprise world, which is where most people will work in tech, it's very competitive. And you have to come to work every day with the mindset that, well, I'll back up. If you love what you do and you are staying up on things, then you will be fine. You will have a job. If they make cutbacks or there's some other ancillary things, that's okay. And even if you lose that job, if you did your best, that's all that matters, because doing your best, that bar continues to move, right? Your best continues to get much better. But, you have to keep in mind, though, like you mentioned, that it's very competitive. And if you're not good at what you do, if you're not trying to improve, they can bring somebody else in and they can get rid of you, right? So there's no entitlement really to, I got this third, I should be doing X. It's like, how are you performing in the job? Are you continuing to learn new things? Are you continuing to move forward? Because everything that you and I study, we didn't create it. It was written by other people, which means anybody with the drive and the know-how and the determination can go home today, spin up an EVE-NG lab today, register for an AWS cloud account or an Azure cloud account today, and start learning and look at the syllabus and build things for free. And if that person is more motivated than me and they bring that person in and there are layoffs, they're going to say, who are we going to go with? The person who's been here for a while, who hasn't really done any new things, or this other person who we've just brought in, maybe they're making a little bit less, maybe they're making the same, but they have the drive to move forward. So that's why if you're learning every day, like we talked about Vladimir Horowitz, if you do a little every day, you'll get better every day. But if you're not doing that, you're going to stop and your knowledge is going to stop and you're going to be good at what you do, but it's going to be hard for you to learn new things when you have to, because it's not in your process.
Right. Man, this has been an amazing conversation that I've had with you, and I'm very sad that we're getting close to time, but I definitely at some point would love to bring you back.
Oh, thank you. I'd be happy
in a
to.
couple months, and continue the conversation and kind of even dig more into kind of what you have accomplished in your career. Some getting into a little bit more detail about the different roles, maybe some of your interviewing techniques, things of that nature. But I mean, I'm very appreciative, and I'm so happy that that you agreed to come on the show. And
Oh no, thank you. It was mine. When you asked me, I was like, "You want me to come on there? I'll help you. I hope you can edit it." But no, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here.
yeah,
Really
no,
honor to be here.
and definitely I can see your passion for teaching coming across, right? Like just the way that you explain things. So I mean, you didn't become a teacher, but I know that you are definitely helping a lot of people who are watching or listening to this, and throughout your career. So thanks again.
No, happy. And if anybody wants to reach out, I mean, feel free to reach out. I mean, I'm happy to share knowledge, experience. The only thing I ask is if you reach out to me, you do the same, right? If somebody else, put yourself in a situation where somebody can reach out to you, and then everybody continues to learn. I wouldn't be where I am without people like you and other people who've helped me too. So
Got it. Yeah, definitely. I'll put it in the show notes and everything. I'll put all your contact information. And yeah, thanks again.
hey, no problem. Thank you.
All right,
Pleasure.
take it easy.